The rain came down in sheets that evening, a cold, relentless drumming against the cobblestones of Havenport, a sleepy coastal town where the sea whispered secrets to the shore. Clara Henshaw trudged along the narrow sidewalk, her umbrella a flimsy shield against the deluge, its ribs creaking like the bones of some weary beast. She was 38, a librarian whose days were stitched together with the soft rustle of pages and the faint musk of aging paper, her life a quiet tapestry of routine since her parents slipped away, one to sickness, the other to grief, 5 years past. The library closed at 6, and now, at past, the world was a blur of wet shadows and the hiss of tires on the road beyond. Her boots squelched with each step, the leather sodden and protesting, and she kept her head down, her thoughts a familiar loop: home, tea, the book on the nightstand, repeat tomorrow. The wind tugged at her scarf, a faded green thing her mother had knit, and she clutched it tighter, as if it might unravel the last thread of warmth she carried. Havenport was small, its streets a grid of salt-bleached cottages and shuttered shops, and Clara knew every crack in the pavement, every groan of the old oak by the post office. It was a comfort, this predictability, but tonight it pressed against her chest like a stone. She was nearly home, her apartment above the bakery, where the scent of yeast lingered even now, when something stopped her. A sound, faint and trembling, cut through the rain's steady roar. Clara paused, her breath fogging in the damp air, and tilted her head. There it was again, a soft, pitiful chirp, like a note dropped from a broken melody. Curiosity nudged her, sharp and unexpected, and she turned toward the bench by the bus stop, its slats glistening under the street lamp's feeble glow. Beneath it, huddled against the leg of the bench, was a sparrow. Tiny, drenched, its feathers plastered to its fragile frame, it shivered violently, one wing bent at an odd angle. Clara's heart gave a lurch, a pang she hadn't felt in years. She crouched, heedless of the puddle soaking her knees, and peered closer. The bird's black eyes blinked up at her, bright with fear or pain, she couldn't tell, and its beak parted in another weak cry. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rain's patter. For a moment, she hesitated. She could walk away, leave it to nature's indifferent hand. Birds died all the time, didn't they? She wasn't a savior, just a woman with a quiet life and a stack of books to shelve. But the sparrow shivered again, and something in Clara cracked open, a long-buried ache, a memory of her father whistling in the garden, her mother laughing as they fed crumbs to the finches. She couldn't leave it. Not tonight. With a gentleness she didn't know she still possessed, Clara slipped off her scarf and draped it over her hands, scooping the bird into a makeshift cradle. It weighed almost nothing, a damp scrap of life, and she tucked it against her coat, shielding it from the wind. "Hold on, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of resolve and fear. What was she doing? She knew nothing about birds, nothing about fixing what was broken. Yet her feet carried her homeward, faster now, the rain a cold lash against her cheeks. Her apartment was a small, orderly cave, a sagging sofa, a kettle on the stove, shelves groaning with novels and poetry. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she kicked off her boots, leaving a trail of wet prints to the kitchen. She set the sparrow on the counter, still wrapped in her scarf, and stood there, dripping and uncertain. Its chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, and Clara's own breath hitched. "Don't die," she said softly, as if it could understand. "Not yet." She rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a spool of thread, a popsicle stick from some forgotten craft, and a roll of tape, her hands shaking as she fashioned a clumsy splint. The bird flinched but didn't fight, too weak or too trusting, and Clara worked with a focus she hadn't felt in years. She snipped the stick to size, bound it to the wing with careful loops of thread, and taped it secure. It was rough, absurdly makeshift, but when she finished, the sparrow looked less broken, somehow. She found an old shoebox, lined it with a dish towel, and nestled the bird inside. "Pip," she said suddenly, the name slipping out unbidden, a nod to the Dickens she'd read as a girl, to the smallness of this creature against the vast, lonely world. Pip chirped once, faint but clear, and Clara smiled, a tentative curve of her lips. She softened a crumb of bread and water and offered it, watching as Pip pecked at it with fragile determination. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the windows, but inside, the silence felt different, less empty. Clara sank onto a chair, her coat still dripping, and stared at the shoebox. What had she done? She'd brought this wild, broken thing into her life, a life so carefully ordered, so deliberately small. Fear flickered in her chest, but beneath it, something warmer stirred, a glimmer of purpose, fragile as Pip's wing, but alive. For the first time in years, Clara didn't reach for her book. She sat there, listening to the rain and the soft rustle of a sparrow settling into her world, wondering what came next. The next morning dawned gray and sodden, the storm's fury spent, leaving Havenport draped in a damp hush. Clara woke to the faint tick of raindrops sliding down the windowpane, her neck stiff from dozing in the kitchen chair. The shoebox sat on the counter, a quiet sentinel, and for a moment, she feared the worst, Pip gone in the night, her small act of courage undone. But then came a chirp, soft as a sigh, and her breath caught. She leaned forward, peering into the box. Pip blinked up at her, feathers ruffled but dry, the splint still holding. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she murmured, a smile tugging at her lips despite the ache in her bones. The apartment smelled of wet wool and stale tea, her coat still crumpled on the floor where she'd shed it. Clara rose, joints creaking like the floorboards, and set the kettle to boil. Routine beckoned, shower, dress, library by 8, but Pip's presence tugged at her, a thread pulling loose from the fabric of her days. She crumbled more bread into a saucer, softening it with water, and watched as Pip pecked at it, tiny beak tapping a rhythm against the porcelain. Each bite felt like a victory, a shared defiance against the fragility of things. She should have gone to work. The library wouldn't miss her for one day, but the guilt nipped at her heels. Mrs. Tate would tut over unshelved returns, Mr. Harrow would grumble about his newspaper being late. Yet Clara stayed, phone untouched, her world narrowing to the sparrow and the soft hum of the radiator. She dragged an old desk lamp closer, its warm glow bathing Pip in light, and sat cross-legged on the floor, chin in hands. "What do you need, little one?" she asked, half to herself. The question lingered, unanswered but heavy. By noon, curiosity won out. She pulled her laptop from its dusty perch and typed how to care for a broken sparrow wing. The screen flooded with advice, rest, warmth, mashed seeds, and Clara scribbled notes on a grocery list, her handwriting shaky with purpose. She ventured out only once, to the corner store, returning with a bag of millet and a cheap pair of tweezers, her cheeks flushed from the wind. Back home, she ground the seeds into a paste, coaxing Pip to eat from her fingertip. The bird's beak brushed her skin, a fleeting warmth, and Clara froze, heart thudding. It was the closest she'd come to touch in years. Days blurred into a quiet rhythm. She called in sick, first one day, then two, her voice steady on the phone, though her hands trembled. The library could wait, Pip could not. Each morning, she checked the splint, adjusting it with growing confidence, her fingers learning the delicate curve of a wing. Each evening, she sat by the box, reading aloud from Great Expectations, Pip's namesake, her voice a low murmur against the creak of the settling building. "You're better company than Magwitch," she told the bird, and chuckled, the sound rusty but real. Then came the chirps. At first, they were faint, sporadic, a plea or a complaint, Clara couldn't tell. But by the 5th day, they grew bolder, a string of notes that danced through the apartment's stillness. She caught herself humming along, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, the melody rising unbidden from some locked-away place. Her voice cracked, hesitant, but Pip tilted his head as if listening, and she pressed on, louder now. The walls seemed to lean in, the room less hollow, and Clara felt a stir, a longing she'd buried with her parents' laughter, a need to be heard. She opened the window one afternoon, letting the sea breeze sweep in, briny and sharp. Pip hopped to the edge of the box, chirping at the gulls wheeling overhead, and Clara laughed, a full, unguarded sound that startled her. "You're a noisy little thing," she said, and he chirped again, as if in agreement. The sound carried, spilling out into the street below, and she didn't close the window. Let the town hear. Let it know she was still here. That evening, a knock rattled the door. Clara flinched, her song dying mid-note. She peered through the peephole, Mrs. Grady from downstairs, her gray hair a frizzy halo, holding a tin of cookies. "Heard your bird," the old woman said when Clara cracked the door. "Thought you might like these, oats and honey, good for energy." Her eyes crinkled, warm but prying. Clara stammered a thank you, clutching the tin, and Mrs. Grady lingered. "You've got a nice voice, dear. Didn't know you sang." "I don't," Clara said, then softer, "I didn't." Mrs. Grady nodded, as if that made sense, and shuffled off, leaving Clara with the cookies and a flush of something, shame? Pride, heating her cheeks. She shut the door, leaning against it, and looked at Pip, who chirped obliviously. "This is your fault," she told him, but her tone was fond, the edge of a smile creeping back. That night, she sang again, softer now, the lullaby weaving through the dark. Pip settled into his box, eyes half closed, and Clara felt the weight of her solitude shift, not gone, but lighter. She'd built a life of quiet edges, a fortress of books and closed windows, but this tiny bird had slipped through the cracks, bringing sound, touch, a tether to something beyond herself. Fear still lingered, what if he healed, what if he left, but beneath it, a determination took root. She'd see him through. She'd keep singing. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The days stretched into a week, then two, and Havenport softened under a tentative spring, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and budding lilacs. Clara's apartment, once a cocoon of dust and silence, hummed with new life. Pip's chirps greeted her each morning, a bright staccato that pulled her from sleep before the alarm's shrill cry. She'd stumble to the kitchen, bleary-eyed but smiling, and set out his breakfast, millet paste, a drop of water from a spoon, her fingers steady now, practiced in their care. The splint held firm, though Pip tested it, hopping from box to counter, his good wing fluttering like a flag of defiance. Clara returned to the library, her absence explained with a vague "I wasn't well," though Mrs. Tate's arched brow suggested she wasn't fooled. The stacks welcomed her back, their familiar weight a comfort, but something had shifted. She caught herself humming as she shelved books, the tune spilling out soft and unbidden, and patrons glanced her way, some startled, some amused. Old Mr. Harrow, perched at his usual table with the Havenport Herald, grunted, "You're chipper today," and Clara flushed, ducking behind a cart. But the song stayed, a quiet rebellion against the gray of her old rhythm. At home, Pip's melodies grew stronger, weaving through the apartment like threads of light. She'd sit by the open window, book forgotten in her lap, and listen as he called to the world beyond. The gulls answered, their cries a harsh counterpoint, and Clara wondered what he heard, freedom, perhaps, or a longing she couldn't name. She'd trace the edge of his splint, checking for wear, and murmur, "Not yet, little one. Soon." The words were a promise, but they pricked her heart. Soon meant flight. Soon meant goodbye. The neighbors noticed. It started with Mrs. Grady's cookies, a tin left like an offering, but then came Mr. Patel from the bakery below, his apron dusted with flour, peering up at her window one afternoon. "That your bird singing?" he called, his voice carrying over the hum of the street. Clara leaned out, clutching the sill, and nodded. "He's healing," she said, surprised by the pride in her tone. Mr. Patel grinned, wide and warm. "Good to hear some life up there. Bring him down sometime, my girl loves animals." She mumbled a maybe, retreating inside, but the invitation lingered, warm as the bakery's yeasty breath. Then came the children. Two of them, scrawny and windblown, lingered by the stoop one Saturday, their bikes propped against the lamppost. "Is that a real bird?" the girl asked, her braids swinging as she craned her neck. Clara, halfway out the door with a bag of trash, froze. "Yes," she said, softer than intended. "He's called Pip." The boy squinted, skeptical. "Can we see?" She hesitated, the old instinct to retreat clawing at her, but Pip chirped from within, bright and insistent, and she sighed. "Just for a minute." Upstairs, they crowded around the shoebox, eyes wide as Pip hopped to greet them. "He's tiny," the girl, Lila, she said, gushed, while her brother, Sam, poked a finger too close. Clara tensed, but Pip merely chirped, unbothered, and she relaxed. He broke his wing, she explained, pointing to the splint. I'm fixing him up. Lila's gaze flicked to her, curious. You're good at that. Clara blinked, the words settling like a stone in her chest. Was she? She didn't know, but she smiled anyway, faint and real. Word spread, as it does in small towns. By Monday, Mrs. Grady was back, this time with a jar of jam, for your bird's bread, and Mr. Patel sent up a scone, still warm, with a note, for the singer and her friend. Clara stared at the gifts, lined up on her counter like treasures, and felt a pang, gratitude, yes, but fear too. She'd built walls of solitude, brick by brick, and now they were crumbling, pierced by a sparrow's song and the kindness it drew. She didn't know how to be this person, the one people saw, the one they reached for. That night, she tested Pip's wing. She unwound the tape, her breath held, and lifted the splint away. The feathers beneath were matted but whole, the bone straighter than before. Pip flexed, tentative, and flapped once, a clumsy, hopeful motion. Clara's throat tightened. You're getting there, she whispered, and he chirped, loud and clear, as if to say I know. She set him on the windowsill, the breeze ruffling his feathers, and watched him gaze at the sky. Her chest ached, a mix of pride and dread. He'd fly soon. He'd leave. And she'd be alone again, or would she? She sang to him then, the lullaby softer now, her voice a thread between them. The notes drifted out, and below, a shadow paused, Mr. Patel, looking up with a nod. Clara didn't stop. Let him hear. Let them all hear. She wasn't invisible anymore, not with Pip's song echoing hers, not with neighbors knocking and children asking. It scared her, this opening, this vulnerability, but it warmed her too, a quiet fire kindling in the dark. When she tucked Pip back into his box, her fingers brushed his head, and he leaned into the touch, a small act of trust. Clara sat there, the room settling around her, and realized she wasn't just fixing him. He was fixing her, stitch by stitch, note by note, pulling her into a world she'd forgotten how to claim. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time, she wanted to find out. Spring unfurled over Havenport like a sigh, the days lengthening, the sea glinting silver under a kinder sun. Clara's apartment buzzed with a rhythm she hardly recognized, Pip's chirps, her own humming, the occasional creak of the stairs as someone climbed to her door. The sparrow's wing had mended, the splint discarded a week ago, and now he flitted from counter to windowsill, a blur of brown and daring. Clara watched him, her heart a tangle of pride and unease. He was whole again, his song a bright trill that spilled out to the street, and she knew what it meant, he'd fly soon, truly fly, beyond her reach. She'd taken to leaving the window wide, the sash propped with a book, Wuthering Heights, its spine cracked from years of rereading. Pip would perch there, head cocked, gazing at the gulls and the rooftops, his wings twitching with instinct. Clara murmured to him, go on, if you're ready, but he'd hop back to her, chirping as if to say not yet. She didn't push. She couldn't. Each day he stayed felt like a gift, though it sharpened the ache beneath her ribs. What would she be without him? The town wouldn't let her wander alone. Mrs. Grady came by with a knitted square, a mat for his box, she insisted, her gnarled hands pressing it into Clara's. Mr. Patel's daughter, Priya, a shy girl of 9, slipped upstairs with Lila and Sam, their laughter ringing as they tossed crumbs for Pip to chase. He's fast now. Priya giggled, and Clara nodded, her throat tight. They saw him as a marvel, a story unfolding, and she let them, though it meant letting them see her too, rumpled, quiet Clara, who sang when she thought no one listened. One evening, as the sky blushed pink, Pip took his first real flight. Clara was at the stove, stirring oatmeal, when she heard a flutter, a soft whoosh, then silence. She turned, spoon dripping, and saw him airborne, circling the room in a wobbly arc. He landed on the bookshelf, chirping triumphantly, and she laughed, loud and unguarded, the sound bouncing off the walls. You did it, Pip, she cried, clapping her hands like a child. He flapped again, swooping to her shoulder, his claws a gentle prick through her sweater. She froze, breath held, feeling the warmth of him, the trust. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, grinning instead. The next day, she decided. "We're celebrating," she told Pip, who tilted his head as if he understood. She scribbled notes, hasty, nervous invitations, and slipped them under doors: Mrs. Grady, Mr. Patel and Priya, Lila and Sam. "Pip's flying. Come see. 7 p.m. Her hand shook as she wrote, doubt gnawing at her. What was she doing, inviting people in? Her apartment was small, her life smaller, she had no snacks, no plan. But Pip chirped, hopping to the windowsill, and she squared her shoulders. For him, she'd try. By 7, the room was a chaos of warmth. Mrs. Grady brought scones, still steaming, their buttery scent mingling with the sea air. Mr. Patel carried a tray of pakoras, crisp and golden, while Lila and Sam clutched a jar of wildflowers plucked from the roadside. Priya hovered by Clara, whispering, "Can I hold him?" and Clara nodded, guiding her small hands to cradle Pip. He chirped, unfazed, and the children gasped, delighted. The floorboards groaned under the weight of chatter and footsteps, the walls seeming to stretch to hold them all. Clara stood by the window, a mug of tea trembling in her grip, watching it unfold. Mrs. Grady patted her arm, murmuring, "You've done well by that bird," and Mr. Patel toasted her with a pakora, "To Pip's wings and your voice." The words landed soft but heavy, and she ducked her head, a flush creeping up her neck. She hadn't meant for this, a gathering, a spotlight, but here it was, and it didn't feel wrong. Pip flitted from shoulder to shelf, a guest of honor, his song weaving through their voices. Then came the moment. She opened the window wider, the night air cool and sharp, and set Pip on the sill. "Show them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He hesitated, feathers ruffling, then launched, a swift, sure arc out into the dusk. The room hushed, all eyes following as he soared above the street, a speck against the fading light, then circled back, landing neatly on the sill. A cheer erupted, small but fierce, and Clara's chest swelled, tears pricking again. "He came back," she said, to no one and everyone, and Mrs. Grady squeezed her hand. They lingered late, the children yawning, the scones reduced to crumbs. As they left, Mr. Patel pressed a warm hand to her shoulder. "You're not alone up here anymore," and Lila called, "Sing tomorrow, okay?" Clara shut the door, the silence settling soft and full, Pip dozing in his box. She sank onto the sofa, the wildflower scent faint in the air, and felt the weight of it. She'd opened her world, just a crack, and it hadn't broken her. It had grown. She sang then, a lullaby low and tender, her voice steady now. Pip stirred, chirping once, and she smiled. He'd fly again tomorrow, maybe farther, maybe for good, but tonight, he was here, and so were the echoes of laughter, the warmth of touch. Clara didn't fear the quiet anymore. She'd filled it, with him, with them, and with a courage she hadn't known she had. Summer slipped into Havenport with a whisper, the days unfurling long and golden, the sea beyond the town shimmering like a promise kept. Clara's apartment had shed its old skin, a small perch, whittled from driftwood and nailed to the windowsill, stood as a testament to her hand's newfound purpose, its edges worn smooth by her careful sanding. A scattering of millet seeds dusted the counter each morning, a quiet ritual, and Pip, her sparrow, her spark, came and went as he pleased. He'd take flight at dawn, a swift blur against the rooftops, tracing paths to the oak by the post office or the salt-bleached fence near the pier, only to return by midday, his chirps a bright thread pulling her through the hours. Clara no longer flinched when he left. The first few times, her heart had clenched, a silent plea, "Come back, don't leave me," but he always did, swooping through the open window with a trill that seemed to say, "I'm here." She'd greet him with a smile, soft and unguarded, and scatter seeds on the sill, her fingers brushing the perch as if to anchor herself. He was free now, his wings strong, his song a bold ribbon woven into the town's hum, yet he chose her, day after day. It was enough, more than enough, to quiet the old fears. The library felt lighter too, its air less heavy with dust and silence. Clara moved through the stacks with a rhythm she hadn't known she'd lost, her boots tapping the floorboards, her humming a gentle undercurrent to the shuffle of pages. Mr. Harrow, hunched over his newspaper, glanced up one morning and muttered, "Bird still with you?" She nodded, her voice steady. "Still singing." He huffed, a sound that might have been approval, and she carried on, shelving a worn copy of Jane Eyre with a flicker of pride. Mrs. Tate caught her later, pausing by the desk. "You've got a glow, Clara. It's good to see." The words landed soft, a pebble in still water, and Clara felt their ripples all day. Home had become something else, a space not just hers but shared, its edges softened by voices and footsteps. Mrs. Grady climbed the stairs now and then, her cane tapping a slow beat, a tin of tea leaves in hand. "For your evenings," she'd say, settling on the sofa to recount tales of Havenport's wilder days, her laughter a creak of joy. Priya slipped up with sketches, Pip in bold crayon strokes, wings outstretched, her shy grin blooming when Clara pinned them to the fridge. Lila and Sam biked by, their shouts rising like gulls, and Mr. Patel sent pastries, their warmth seeping through paper bags, a silent nod to the songs that drifted down each dusk. One afternoon, as the sun hung low, gilding the room in honeyed light, Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, a needle glinting between her fingers. She'd unearthed her mother's sewing box from a closet corner, its hinges stiff with disuse, and pulled out a spool of green thread, a scrap of faded cotton. Her hands moved with a tentative grace, stitching a tiny mat for Pip's perch, something soft, something hers. The needle slipped once, pricking her skin, and she chuckled, the sound bright against the radiator's hum. Pip hopped closer, pecking at the thread, and she nudged him away. "You'll ruin it, you little menace," she said, her tone fond, her heart full. He flew then, a swift arc out the window, his wings cutting through the breeze. Clara leaned out, watching him climb, a speck against the amber sky, then circle back, landing on the perch with a triumphant chirp. She sang to him, the old lullaby rising unbidden, her voice a quiet weave of memory and hope. It drifted down, mingling with the sea's sigh and the clatter of Mr. Patel locking up below. He waved, a shadow against the bakery's glow, and she waved back, unafraid to be seen. That night, she sat by the window, the mat finished and tucked beneath Pip's perch, its green a echo of the scarf she'd given up that stormy evening. Pip dozed nearby, feathers ruffled, and Clara traced the sill with her fingertip, feeling the grain of the wood, the weight of months past. She'd been a ghost once, drifting through a life of closed doors and muted days, but Pip had changed that, his broken wing, his stubborn song, his trust. He'd drawn her out, stitch by stitch, and the town had met her halfway, with scones and sketches and voices that filled her silence. She didn't fear the quiet now. It wasn't empty anymore, it held echoes of laughter, the rustle of wings, the melody she'd reclaimed. Pip might leave one day, truly leave, but she'd be all right. She'd built something, a perch, a home, a life, and it would stand, steady and warm, long after his shadow faded from the sky.